Hi everybody and welcome back to lecture. Today we're going to be focusing on the topic of reentry, and we're going to throw in a little bit of parole in there as well because most of our inmates who are returning might be going through this parole process, especially at the state level. And the topic of reentry for this class and for the general discussion of the criminal justice system is really one of the most important topics that we'll be talking about in general and in this semester in this class. But it's really such an important, pervasive topic that it reaches all different areas of the criminal justice system as we talk about it. So if you think about the topic of reentry, we have a bunch of inmates who may have spent what is a considerable amount of time incarcerated and away from their families for a specific number of years. And everything that they have encountered while they are incarcerated can be thought of as sort of an insulated bubble, right? Not much changes while they're in prison, not much changes in their environment, but think of all the things that are changing in the world around us while they're currently incarcerated. And think about how much autonomy is really taken away from you while you are incarcerated. Think about just the number of things that are taken away from inmates on a daily basis. Somebody else is telling you when you're allowed to eat, when you can shower, when you get to go to sleep, when you get to go outside and experience rec time, when you're allowed to make a phone call. All of these things that you used to do and you would take for granted are now sort of being dictated to you in terms of acceptability when you're allowed to do it. And this has been your life for the last 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 15 years, whatever it may be. This has been your routine. And as we've talked about in terms of life in prison, a lot of this is about adaptation. Some of this is about survival. Some of this is just making it to the end of your prison sentence. So it becomes very comfortable to be told what to do. I know that every night my lights will go off at this time, and I know on every Wednesday I will have phone privileges. Every Saturday I will have visitation with my family if my family's still coming by. So if you're in this environment that has become very structured, very rigid, very routine, and now you're sent out into the real world post-incarceration, think about the number of things that have been happening in the regular real world, how we keep evolving and keep progressing, and your life in prison has stayed the same. Just think about the first time you leave prison and you go out to eat. The number of choices that are on menus anymore is just staggering. Right? Think about this. And this was something one of my boyfriend's coworkers got out of prison maybe a little bit less than a year ago for DUI. It was, I think, his fourth or fifth DUI, and he went away for, I think it was like 8 years or something like that. And he came out, and in that period of time, McDonald's started offering breakfast all day. And for us, it was like, woo, it's finally here. I can get an Egg McMuffin at 11 instead of 10:30. But think about just what a change that is, because for how many years McDonald's used to have breakfast only until a certain point in time. And he comes out and that's different. And phones have evolved and all this different stuff we'll talk about later. But just think about how daunting and how much of a shock it would be to come out and experience all these changes in a short amount of time. And one of the things that we really fail inmates on is the opportunity to prepare for reentry. So if you don't have any services that are sent your way to help prepare you for reentry, you're basically going into this brand new environment blind. And if you don't have any sort of support system, what shot do you have of being successfully able to reenter? Probably not a very good one. So when we're talking about reentry, really what we're talking about is anything that happens post conviction. So even if you've never been incarcerated and you're just living life on probation, that's still part of the reentry issue. We're still talking about somebody who is having to figure out how to live with this new label attached to them. But the bigger concern is really everybody, not necessarily post-conviction, but post-incarceration. So as you're released from your prison or jail sentence, and you're released maybe after you finish that sentence entirely, or you finish that sentence on parole. You're coming out into the community, and that's what we're going to be talking about, that part of the reentry process. So when we talk about parole, there's a couple different ways in which an inmate can be released. Remember that at the federal level, parole has pretty much been entirely abolished post 1984. So most of the parole decisions that are still taking place are happening on the state level. So parole is attached to an indeterminate sentence. If I receive a sentence of 5 to 10 years, 5 years is the earliest in which I have the potential to be released from prison. It's not a guarantee, but it's the earliest potential for a parole hearing. So let's say after the 5 years, what did I want to say? I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Okay, so after the first 5 years, I have the potential to be released on parole. So it's your parole board hearing, and there's a number of things that are taken into account. If you are released that day, or if the decision is made that day, you wouldn't be released that day. But if that decision was made that day, this is a form of discretionary parole, in which your release is not mandatory, but the parole board has taken in a variety of different things into account. So things like your behavior while you're incarcerated, your age, your gender, your race, what was the nature of the criminal offense that you were incarcerated for? Did you do anything else while you were incarcerated that might be considered a disciplinary issue? Did you have any criminal accomplices on the outside? What was the length and nature of your sentence? Did you serve any time before your trial date? Let's see, did you plea? Any sort of trial recommendations that the judge may have made? All of these things really are taken into account by the parole board. And when the parole board makes their decision, they can either say, okay, yes, we grant you parole, or no, come back in a certain number of years and we'll try this again. So if they grant you parole that day, that's called discretionary parole, and it's up to the discretion of the parole board. Sorry, my space heater, it's freezing in my office today, and my space heater just went on. I don't need you to listen to that. So if the parole board grants you parole, it's called discretionary release, but it's not mandatory. It's up to the discretion of the parole board as to whether or not they want to release you that day. So if you are released, you then serve the remainder of your next 5 years, or however many years, out in the community, and you're living on parole. Parole is not a separate sentence. Parole is the continued serving of your original incarceration sentence. Probation, on the other hand, is an entirely separate sentence that you would receive at the time of your sentencing. So if you are released on parole, then you're going to have to live under certain conditions, just like a regular probationer would. So you might have a curfew, you might be under house arrest, drug testing, you might have to go to AA or NA, steady employment, don't talk to other felons or co-conspirators. If you have a victim, you're not allowed to go talk or spend time with that victim, things like that. And if you do anything that would violate your parole chances, they might revocate you and send you back to prison, and then you would serve out the remainder of your incarceration sentence inside the prison. Mandatory parole, on the other hand, is a little bit different than discretionary parole, and normally this is used with more determinate sentencing or truth in sentencing structures. And basically what that means is, after an obligatory number of years based on statutory requirements, the inmate is going to be released on parole. So it's not necessarily about good behavior while you're incarcerated. It doesn't necessarily mean that you would be denied. At this point in time, we would release you based on good time credits, or the remainder of your sentence is just this much and out the door you go. So mandatory parole is really based on the statutory requirements rather than on the discretion of the parole board. So there's a little less leeway there compared to the discretionary aspects of it. So either way, if you serve out the entirety of your sentence, you're released early on discretionary parole, or you're released a little later on mandatory parole. Either way, everyone is eventually coming home for the most part, and is beginning this process of community reintegration, or what we call reentry. So as an offender is coming out, think of all the different things that he or she would want to do. I want to go visit with my family. I want to catch up with friends. If I have children, I want to start renewing my relationship with my children. But everybody is pretty much going through reentry. So it's a very different thing for the offender to go through it versus the family member. But many inmates who are being released are oftentimes going into low income areas, and many of them are not coming home to a very strong support system. Many of these inmates don't lack a very high level of formal education, and in talking about the support system, there might be a family member or two who are still sticking around, but statistically we see that there's a strong drop off in the level of contact that family members and friends have with inmates after the first 3 years of incarceration. So if you're serving a prison sentence longer than that, the likelihood of you having an intact support structure goes way, way down. And it might be the time, right? Family members are trying to keep up with you, but life is going on and my kids are getting older and I have all these things I need to do, and it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it happens. Another thing that might contribute to it is the nature of your crime, right? I think you're a terrible, awful person. I don't want to associate with you. I don't want my kids associating with you. I'm just going to abandon you, right? So either way, if you don't have this support system, it makes reentry a lot harder and the rate of failure a little higher. But if you do have a support system, I mean, that in and of itself really boosts your chances for successful reentry efforts. Just having people to lean on, having potential financial security, that I'm looking for a job, but my parents are willing to take me in, or my sibling is willing to take me in, or maybe I'm married and I go right back home to my family and my significant other has been working all this time and money is not as big an issue as it would be for somebody with no support system, right? So if you have the support system, it's great and it gives you something to fall back on, but it's still a work in progress. You've been gone for X number of years and you now have to work on rebuilding and regaining trust within that family system. Life has continued on. Your children may have been a lot younger when you went inside, and you're coming out and now you're trying to reinsert yourself into their lives and they don't remember you as well as you had hoped. So there's a lot of strain and a lot of stress that is put on these relationships, and even though the support system is in place, it still makes the reentry process a little more difficult in the beginning because there's a lot that you have to contend with. But financially, financially, inmates are just not prepared at all for life outside of prison. If you think about all this time they've spent incarcerated, that's years and years of financial loss from not being employed. Many of them do not have money when they are released. So the prison may give them their possessions back, maybe $100, a bus ticket. Good luck and be on your way. And that's really all the support that they get from the state. Many of them are not getting any sort of medications if they need them. So think about if you are bipolar or schizophrenic, or you have any sort of mental health issue, the prison is sending you off into the world with maybe a week's worth of medication at best. They're expecting you to see a doctor right away, to get your own prescriptions. You're free, you're independent, this is all on you now. But how many inmates who are returning to society have health insurance, have a doctor that they can just walk in after 7 days and be like, hey, I need a refill, right? It's not very likely. So you maybe get a week's worth of medication and you're walking out the door with no health coverage, potentially no way to pay for a refill. It's a terrible situation, but that's the reality of what's happening right now. So they're not prepared financially. They potentially have no emotional family support system to walk back into, so they're unprepared. They're walking into a world that is very foreign to them, that has changed a lot since they were incarcerated. They get scared, they panic, and sometimes they commit additional crimes, which sends them right back to jail, and we're going to start this whole process over. But if the state were to prepare them better and to provide them some sort of reentry services or some sort of support to help them post-release, then potentially we could help correct this problem. Because the whole idea of the correctional system is to stop the revolving door, to correct the behavior, to set this person back on a more positive path so that their life is not a continuous revolving door back into and back out of incarceration facilities. And statistically and economically, really, it makes sense because research suggests that if we invest in reentry services, every dollar we invest yields a $35 return on that original investment. And that's money that we're not spending on continued incarceration, that we're not spending on additional court costs, on public defenders, on additional and new trials. All of this stuff is being eliminated because we're helping the offender the first go around. And it's not going to happen successfully for everybody every single time, right? But a $1 investment yields a $35 return. That's really good if you think about things from a budgetary perspective. We're spending a little bit more in our reentry budget, but look at how much we're saving in our court costs, in our incarceration costs, and all kinds of other different settings. So why aren't we doing it? Here's the thing. That money that we would have to invest in reentry services has to come from somewhere. And largely it's coming from taxpayer dollars. And many people do not want to pay for these services. They support these services until they find out that it's taxpayer funded. And then they're, oh, no. Nope. I don't want to pay for that person's mistake. And to an extent, that's understandable. Right? But we're paying for it anyway. We're paying for it in incarceration costs. We're paying for it with public defender costs. We're paying for it in court costs. We're paying for it regardless. And whether or not you want to invest money in reentry services, these people are coming home. And when they do panic and they do go through the system the second time, you're paying for it then. So why would you not want to say, okay, it's not ideal, but I'd rather my money go here and help these individuals so that I don't have to pay twice, 3 times, 4 times as much money over here trying to house all these individuals within an incarceration sentence. Because when I say they're coming home, about 90% of inmates will come home after serving their incarceration sentences. That excludes obviously people who are incarcerated for life without parole, people on death row, people who pass away in prison, but 90% of inmates are coming home at some point. So this is a very large issue that we're talking about on a yearly basis. Because reentry is not going away anytime soon. If anything, it's getting bigger. And the time to invest money in reentry services is when they are about to be released into the first 6 months. So when inmates are released, you imagine that there has to be a little bit of adjustment period. I get to go home, I see my family, I see my friends if they're available and that they still want to connect with me. And I'm just enjoying the fact that I'm free for a little while, right? And I have to start looking for a job and I have to start looking for a place to live. And all of this takes time. This is not something that gets set up within the first week of you being released unless, like I said, you're walking into something where your family has already done this for you. But if you're doing this on your own, it's hard to find an apartment. You have to get your driver's license back. You have to find money for a deposit. You have to get a job. You can't put the money down on the apartment if you don't have the job to be able to get that money. So the first 6 months post-release are crucial. That's where inmates slip up the most. That's when the desperation kicks in the most. And that's when people start doing stupid things that get them sent back to jail and start the whole cycle again. So if you can provide reentry services before they're released through the first 6 months, inmates have a much better rate of success than if there is nothing there at all. But regardless, even if you do provide reentry services, reentry is just so hard. It's one of the biggest obstacles that many inmates will face, and it's hard for everybody involved. The offender is coming out and has to adjust to an entirely different world that was different from when he or she went in. Family members, friends, everyone is adapting and having to change expectations of this person, right? So if I went in when I was a young adult and I'm coming in out as a 45-year-old, I've had no job training, no life experience. I've wasted my life while I was incarcerated. I'm definitely not the same person coming out as when I went into prison, right? So my parents have to adjust to who I am now. My siblings have to adjust. If I have children, my children are grown. I went in and they were infants and now they're grown. And how do I become a parent to them now when they don't need me, perhaps? Think about just the daily life events that I've missed out on while being incarcerated. The number of Christmases and the number of 4th of Julys and birthdays and holidays and vacations and school plays and deaths and weddings and all kinds of things that we take for granted because life is continuously worth living, right? But for someone who is incarcerated, they are in this secure, isolated bubble where time almost seems to stand still. And on the outside, everything keeps changing and everything keeps moving at the speed of light. I mean, think about the technology now that we've had. I mean, the iPhone is 10 plus years old. I think maybe it's 10 years. I don't know. Somewhere around there. And think about how different smartphones are from when smartphones first came out. Think about how fast that technology develops. Think about our cars now. Our cars have satellite radio, power everything. Our cars have Wi-Fi. Our cars stop when we fail to stop, and they tell us when there's people all around us. Like, cars do so many more things than they never have done before. We watch TV differently now, right? People are getting rid of cable because we have Netflix. What's Netflix, right? Or what's Amazon Prime? What are all these things that never existed when I went into prison? We are a society that is becoming very, very reliant on technology. I mean, hell, you don't even have to go grocery shopping anymore. You just tell your phone to tell Brookshires or to tell Walmart, tell whoever, I'll pick my groceries up at 4 o'clock. Right? We are becoming very reliant on technology, and for someone who has been removed from that technology for X number of years, it is a very daunting and overwhelming thing to walk back into. So, I mean, just the craziness that you would encounter when you come back out would be enough to cause some panic and stir a little anxiety in the strongest of individuals. So it's not surprising to me at all that people panic and end up recidivating for these reasons. But, if that happens, you're back to square one and we start the whole process over again. And that's not what we want to happen at all. But unfortunately, that's the situation we're in until we can get more funding for reentry programs, rather. Excuse me. Okay, so enough about this. We could go on and on, I think, but I think we covered a lot of the strong major points that we need to talk about with reentry. So next week, what I'm going to do is we're going to come back and we're going to focus on treatment, and we're going to talk about all of the different issues regarding providing treatment to individuals, where that funding is coming from. Spoiler. Taxpayers once again, and whether or not people even believe that these offenders are capable of change. Should we even be providing treatment to people who cannot change at all? So just some of the things we're going to talk about next week. So meet me back here when we get on that topic, and thank you guys as always for your time and your attention today, and I will see you guys next week. Have a good day, guys. See you later. Bye.